and welcome to today's edition of Horse's Mouth Live, the Extraordinary Advisor Show. My name is Ellen Rogin, and as always, I have great guests who bring really important information to impact you in every area of your life, especially your business. And in a moment, I'll give the formal introduction, but we have Dr. Leah Schweitz here, who is going to talk to us about, or we're going to have a conversation about having end of life conversations with clients. This is, as I was thinking about the show, realized like there are people in the industry that talk about how to talk about grief, but right that area before when someone's at the end of life, I don't think that any of us, and especially advisors, are well equipped to have these conversations. So that's what Leah and I are going to talk about today.
Yeah.
And so let me give you a little bit about her background. Dr. Leah Schweitz is the founder and CEO of Playdates with Death.
Yeah.
Such an interesting name, and we'll talk about that. It's a warm and supportive community that meets online to do end of life planning together so that it's not so scary, lonely, or overwhelming. Leah is a recently divorced and going through stage 4 lung cancer treatment herself. And these life events have inspired her to launch Playdates with Death. And she didn't want to do the important work of end of life planning alone, and she doesn't want others to have to do that either. In her community, they tackle things like advanced medical directives, wills, trusts, to digital legacies, obituaries, end of life celebrations. And they handle it in a way that your loved ones won't have to, so that your loved ones or your clients' loved ones won't have to after they've died. She brings her training in trauma-informed teaching, conflict transformation, group facilitation, and more than a decade of teaching discernment practices to the gatherings of Playdates with Death community. And together they find planning for death can be life-giving. So, Leah, welcome.
Thank
I
you.
I know when we met, I was so intrigued by this idea of Playdates with Death, because that like doesn't go together with how we normally
Yes.
think about this end of life process. So can you just talk a little bit about how you came up with that name or the energy behind these
Yes.
communities, this community that you are creating?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question and the invitation to the conversation. It's, I think, a really important one for all of us to be engaged in. Yeah, so the Playdates with Death, it's supposed to be a little jarring. That's the right reaction. So if it's a little, it makes you kind of scratch your head. That's the first, really the first hope, is to catch your attention in that juxtaposition. So the name itself came, I mean, it was sort of an inspiration that came from one of my kids. When I was first diagnosed with lung cancer, I had one of my care teams, I think with good intention. So it's not really judgment, but they shook their finger at me and told me to get my affairs in order. And I can say that way of inviting me into doing end of life planning was not a great approach, right? It was just filled with so much fear and a little bit of shame that I hadn't already done it. And it was very overwhelming. So, of course, I did absolutely nothing, because fear and shame are not really great motivators to do anything, especially the big important stuff. And so I was on this cancer healing dance journey for many months. I was diagnosed in January, and in about October, my 10-year-old at the time was going to go trick-or-treating on Halloween with a buddy, and his friend emerged in our entryway in a Grim Reaper costume. And it was just so funny to me to have this play date with death with my son happening through Halloween. It just sort of struck a chord. Like that was the journey I had been on, was this long play date with death. And is there a way to kind of marshal that like fun energy of Halloween that's both a little scary, but also really fun and part of a community, and really, life-giving in lots of ways. No, we don't always have candy, but yeah, that was definitely part of the part of the initial origin story of how this thing got going, was to have the Grim Reaper standing in my entryway trick-or-treating.
being in the money world, I've been doing a lot of work lately on money conversations and
Yeah.
why they're so difficult for people, and how, being upfront about what's going on with your money or all these things. And there's been, I don't know, you used to see studies like, oh, people are more apt to talk about their sex life than they are their money. But I'm wondering, and I don't know if there's stats, it doesn't really matter, but why these end of life conversations are so difficult for people. They
Yeah.
feel more difficult than money conversations. And why do you think that is?
Yeah. In the conversation that you've named them, right? Like sex, money, and death. They all tend to be in this context really challenging conversations for folks to have. And in the American context, I think there's just such a reticence. There's so little good sort of death care, end of life literacy in general, in part because of the way Americans mostly die these days, right? It's very removed from your regular life flow. It doesn't happen in the home. It doesn't necessarily happen with your family. We don't have conversations about just like the birthing process. There's sort of regular stages that can have, not in traumatic instances. There's lots of other, there's many ways to die, but there is a pattern, right? And we just don't really have a good, I think, cultural conversation around what the signs and symptoms of death are. And so it's all kind of very unknown and scary for folks in lots of ways. So that kind of lack of information and fear, I think, is baseline. I also have found that there is a good deal of shame around these conversations as well for folks who, parents who haven't done a will or trust for their kids, and now their kids are 13 and they really know that for 10 years or 13 years, they should have done this work already, but haven't. And so I think that there's a lot of that in the culture as well. Some shame about not having done it already. So you're kind of behind the game in some way. So to admit that you haven't done it, you maybe need some help getting it done. All of that, I think, is behind some of the reticence to do it. And I think because we haven't had those conversations, the joy and life-givingness that can come alongside of having these hard conversations with your loved ones, we don't get to that because there's so many steps removed.
Yeah, I hadn't made the connection after having talked to you with the fact that when I was an advisor, the number one area that people would procrastinate on, including my husband and myself,
Yeah.
was getting their estate plan done. Because it's
Absolutely.
not that there's no one I work with that said, oh, I should do that. Like they
Yeah.
knew, right?
Yeah.
And yet, and so I hadn't thought about the fact that how deeply really entwined these are.
And it's
So I'm
generational too, right? And
mm,
so a lot of family systems don't have examples where their parents have had these conversations with them. And so now that there's parents that haven't had them, um, children of these parents who haven't, and these parents who haven't had them with their kids. And so it's, I think, really an interesting moment for us to interrupt kind of the generational silence that has happened around this kind of thing as well.
yeah, I know when right before my dad passed away, he was more ill than I realized he was.
Yeah.
And he was in my office and he started telling me more about his financial situation. I was like, oh, he finally trusts me with more of this. And then I realized he was doing it because he was worried about my mom.
Uh,
And yeah, so there is that generational part. And I also realized Stephen and my husband and I had done a survey that a friend of mine, Colleen Bowler, has created around kind of readiness on things. And as a
mhm.
former financial advisor, I was ready in a bunch of areas. But I realized my husband and I, yes, we had our estate plan done, but we hadn't had a conversation about it with our adult kids.
Yeah,
And they're like totally financially responsible. There
yep.
wasn't like a reason. And we recently did that at the beginning of the summer. And it just feels better that they know
Yep.
around about that.
Yep.
Um,
Absolutely.
I'm I'm curious in the Playdates with Death community, what have you learned about approaching death and conversations, and what are some of the learnings that you've had through running this community?
Yeah, in a way to echo some of that there really is just a good deal of shame and fear that's kind of underlying a lot of what is getting in the way of having this work done or getting to these conversations. And there is some lack of information, but I think also even in my kind of own planning, a deeper sense about it is a big job, right? Getting your affairs in order is really a big job. The lists of things that you named that we cover in Playdates with Death, from, writing obituaries to estate planning to medical directives, even things like who can get access to your cell phone after you've passed, right? There are digital inheritances to consider. So it really is a big list. And the sense of overwhelm for folks, I think, has been one of the key learnings, is that, if there's some ways that we can just help folks really streamline and get the tasks done kind of as efficiently as possible, that has been a big part of the learning. I would say that the other big part of the learning has really been the kind of joy and laughter and life-givingness that doing the work in community can have, because I started trying to do some of this by myself, and that was not the experience that I had of trying to do that by myself. It was very lonely. It can be very lonely work, and for me, I'm recently divorced, and so there was not the kind of first with my partner or my spouse that I was going to be able to do that with. My kids are younger, so they didn't need to be in this first round of that planning, and my mom has her own work to do, and so it really felt very lonely. And the benefits of doing it in community, surrounded by some other folks who didn't want to be overwhelmed and maybe could laugh a little and dance our way out of a meeting, that the way in which it could be really a life-giving part of what we could do has been a big part of that learning.
I'm curious, for a financial advisor, let's say they get the call of one of their clients getting a really bad diagnosis. Like, what are some things that are important for them in terms of communicating with their client or their client's family and spouse, some things to avoid so that they're really using this as a time to be there, supporting their client and helping and not hurting a relationship at a really difficult time?
Yeah, I think this is such key work for all of us. And, there's sort of two parts to that answer. I think the one is really for the financial advisor themselves to have done some work, right? And so it's an invitation, right, as a professional practice to do some of the inner work, to be yourself comfortable talking about death and dying. Folks know, if you are reticent or fearful or overwhelmed about that arena of conversation, that will come across. And so practicing in other low stakes places, to have just some basic literacy and comfort in having these hard conversations, so that the first time you're having to have it isn't when you get that phone call, and sort of practicing with somebody who's already in a hard or traumatic or fragile kind of space. So that's sort of on the one hand, the first bit. Beyond that, I would say, some of the ways that we work in the Playdates with Death community, the way that I've talked about it is that we are always trying to turn the volume down on our nervous system. And so any of the tricks that you can have at your disposal to turn the nervous system down in those very stressful spaces is really helpful. And that can be as simple of, I hear you, this must be a really hard moment. Let's just take a deep breath, right? So that deep breath can be hugely important for both the advisor and the client that you're trying to have a conversation with. We also, some of these I think might be a little trickier, and they're a little bit countercultural to the way that we do kind of a business first approach. But in the Playdates with Death gatherings, we incorporate some movement and some grounding practices. So some stretching, just gentle stretching to go along with that deep breath. We do dance our way. I don't know if you want to start dancing your way out with client meetings, but we do dance our way out. But it's just a way to have the body shake out some of that stress and anxiety that gets carried in. So those are a couple. I would say some of the other things that we do is we keep our work units pretty short. If you use evidence-based around ADHD kinds of practices, 20 minutes is really a long time to have a hard conversations. So making sure that you're having these conversations not in like an epic long retreat version, but to keep them kind of short and bite-sized. That's a huge part of it. And I think whatever you can do to stay kind of in community with them, so it's not a one and done, just like circle back, come back around. I think the subtle one to notice if you're in one-on-one conversations is to pay really close attention to those nonverbal cues for when someone is freaking out, right? And just pause. Kind of the motto is slow and soft. So whatever you can do to have those kinds of conversations happen in a way that is slow and soft, rather than like, we got to get it done fast and efficient. That is just a different kind of value and marker. I think that has to be over top of the whole. And last but not least, I think part of having a follow-up conversation that says, do you feel like you have the tools to talk to your family? And ideally having some of those tools available if they say no, but reminding that next piece is really the conversation to have with your family, or your loved ones, or whomever it is that needs to be kind of in the next circle, to make sure that information, the decisions are being communicated, because otherwise all of that work doesn't bear the fruit that it could.
Yeah, I love that that's a question. Do you feel that you have the tools to do this, that you're exploring? So hopefully an advisor is paying enough attention that they would notice that cue. If someone was needed a pause in that moment, but are there things you would bring to light that might give them something to focus on? Because okay, so here's where I'm imagining the advisor's like, I am so uncomfortable, this person's dying, like they're all back here, and not like, what does this person need, like attention out, to notice that. So recommendations for the advisor to get more present, and also what might be a cue that the person is needing a pause or needs a different kind of support.
So it can be very tricky to figure out, right? So some people are very, very good at masking this sort of thing. But I think if you see defensiveness or anger, maybe even defensiveness or anger, those can be a cue. If you can watch closely enough to see how they're breathing, if all the breathing is coming, fast and shallow, way up high, it means they're definitely in runaway mode, right? They're in runaway mode. And some folks will get sort of far away, right? So you can kind of see them just start to recede. And that's a kind of dissociating move. So any of those that you can pay attention to make a big difference. But I think even if you don't notice it the first round, to have it be a practice to come back around to the conversation, so that both the client doesn't feel like it's so high stakes, right? This is not like the one and only time that you have to get this conversation entirely right, that you can sort of say from the beginning, we're going to come back around to this and make sure everything is exactly the way that you want it, or that you've had some time to reflect and make decisions, maybe talk to your loved ones and come back around. So I think to have the practice, again, this is a way to dial down the nervous system so that it doesn't feel like it's a very high stakes, the only chance you're going to have in order to get this all exactly right the first time around. Is all those are really important practices.
Were there things that people said to you when you were newly diagnosed, or that you're like, that is like the stupidest thing? Like, why would you say that to me? Like things like, just please don't say this if you can avoid it.
Yes. I mean, I would say that get your affairs in order. Not that. Not that.
Okay.
But some version of this must be a really overwhelming time. Is there something I can do to support you? I'm here. It doesn't have to be now. More invitational like that would have been a good one. I think anything that smacks of you can get through it. There's a plan behind it. You're only given more than you can handle. Anything of that variety, especially on a new diagnosis, is not helpful. It's really painful, especially in those early moments, because you really have no idea how that story is going to unfold. You have no idea.
Yeah.
And to say that, some good will come out of it, we don't know.
It'll be
You just don't know.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you just don't
Yeah.
know. I think the I'm here, how can I help you?
Mm.
Those are gold. Those are gold. And sometimes even this is sort of more generally, not specifically for financial advisors, but um, the offer of what I can do so that they don't have to come up with it.
Oh,
So in this case, right, like for instance, having access to be able to send the advanced medical directives form, so they don't have to find it, look for it. Each of those little pieces are so big. That's a huge help. Anytime you can minimize the number of steps to get something done, that can be a huge help.
I would imagine also just filling out form, let's say someone's changing beneficiary forms, or like it is for me, someone who hates forms, not fun to do when I'm in like a great place.
Yeah, yeah,
And I know when I was an advisor, when people would lose a spouse, I would step in more of a way than I might have otherwise in terms of getting on the phone with people with them or
yeah,
things like that. It seems to me that might be a really helpful offer as well. Like, okay, can we hold your I don't want to say hold your hand through this.
yeah, yeah,
Can we do this with you
yeah.
if the advisor isn't able to do it without the clients, being on the phone or present?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, so my own story. That's where I'm. That's it's not an obstacle. I'm not stuck. But so I've gotten that far. I have my trust, my living trust, the will ready, but I haven't yet funded it because it takes all of those next steps. And so it's a doable thing. It just requires the time, energy, and bandwidth. And
Yes.
amidst all of the other things that are happening, that's what's sort of up next. And folks, professionals who are in the position to be able to help streamline, minimize those steps, it's a huge help, particularly in those moments when like a big thing has unfolded in one's life.
Yeah.
Those are hugely helpful steps.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder and suggestion. So to lean in a little bit more on the admin part of things than an
Yep.
advisor might otherwise do.
Yeah.
Um, are there conversations that before someone gets a end of life diagnosis or they're in that situation that advisors should be having with their clients, like pre this happening?
Yeah.
That would be helpful.
Yes, I think a lot of the times the way that we talk about death and dying is in a like a what if mode rather than a when mode, and that's part of the big shift in my cancer diagnosis. Right, was that it very acutely took a what if scenario and made it a when scenario. I mean, hopefully it's a very far into the future when, but it's not hypothetical. It never really was hypothetical, but it's clear, right? It just was one of those, in a way, a gift that the diagnosis has given, is to just make clear that the reality of it. And I think part of the way that we have the conversation is to shift from this kind of like what if to when, um, and that's true for all of us. So with that shift in mind, I think the kind of holistic approach for financial advisors to be part of, it's a when you're doing estate planning, it's an invitation for folks to also make sure. I kind of call this the boot camp, right? To make sure that advanced medical directives and powers of attorney, both for medical and financial, those things are done in addition. And so I think that kind of holistic sense of the death end of life planning conversation, those are all pieces to at least advocate that everybody is doing, has done and has communicated with folks. Is that the kind of conversation that you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think to even switch it from what if to when normalizes.
Right.
I know when my sister-in-law, before she passed away, I remember my husband saying, "As far as I know, no one's escaped this
Right.
eventually." Like we all die at some point.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah. So, in our family, that gave us a chance to talk to our kids too about what we
Yes.
would want, because it would
Yes.
be different for my husband than it would be for me, but that's
Yeah.
cool. Like, we
Yeah.
don't have to have the same desires at end of life.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that one
so
of the things that we assume is that when we're talking about communicating it with our loved ones, we always mean mostly the adults. But
mm,
having the conversations with your kids, even your younger kids, is really important as well. In age appropriate ways. Not to like lay out the whole plan or anything, but just to have continue to kind of normalize those conversations around death and dying is so important. I'd say another piece of the kinds of conversations that could be had is for funeral costs to
mm,
be known and literate and explored as part of what it means to have a fully realized estate plan, so that those kind of funeral costs, maybe not even funeral, like lots of people are doing end of life planning and celebrations in lots of ways, but to have a line that takes that explicitly into account as part of the costs of what it is to transition into the next phase.
beautiful. Anything else you want to make sure you share with this audience about things that are important, or that you would want to just make sure they know about supporting their families, but also their clients in this process, Leah?
Yeah, I mean, the final word that I would love to have on it is that for as big and potentially scary, overwhelming, shame-filled, lonely as it can be, to really have the kind of joy and love and laughter that can, I mean, when you think about some of, maybe this isn't the right way to put it, but the best funerals that you've been to, there is music and laughter and so much love. And I think remembering that this work around end of life planning is really also right next to all of those sort of great things about what it is to be a human, that those come right alongside. So, the payoff benefit of tackling, kind of diving into those hard conversations really is this much more expansive way of getting to be awake and alive and in the world.
Yeah, I love that. I was just when you said that, I thought about my friend Lisa's mom's funeral. It was the funniest funeral I've ever been to, and I remember it, and,
Yeah, yeah,
like, it and, yeah, I'm happy when my time comes for it to be a funny funeral. It
yeah,
can be,
yeah,
it doesn't have to be awful.
yeah.
So, I love the work that you're doing, Leah. If people wanna
Likewise.
learn more about Playdates with Death, or you, or some of the work you're doing, what would be a good way for them to be in touch?
Yeah, playdateswithdeath.substack.com. That's our home. So you can see the events that are coming up. Our next community playdate, we're going to do digital photos, and then we're going to do digital inheritances. November is like next of kin month, where we try to tackle some of the scavenger hunt, and then in December we'll have a conversation. We do some community expert conversations around kind of that estate planning, end of life planning. So we've got some really great things coming up, and you can find
Good.
all the details there.
Good. What a great resource for advisors to share with their clients to
Yeah,
help normalize this and give support in ways that they're, not necessarily able to give, to invite them into their community.
yeah,
Well, thank you so much. I'm so
yeah.
glad our
Okay.
paths crossed, and I
Likewise.
appreciate your generosity sharing this information.
Yeah. Thank you so much for
Uh,
having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you to all of you listening and watching. Again, my name is Ellen Rogin. You can find out more about me at ellenrogan.com. And if you go to ellenrogan.com/horse's mouth, you can download my special report, what extraordinary advisors know that others don't. And depending on when you're watching this, there's still time to jump into our Extraordinary Advisor Masterclass. And this conversation is really helpful for that, because a lot of the work we do is around having super comfortable, bigger, better conversations with our clients and showing up in a much more present way. And so I invite you into that as well. And the message for today is to remember to be great and create great every single day. Thank you so much.